I am really, really excited to be spending our last session today meditating out loud with you all about why and how we name things in software. Now, I've been thinking about, and let's be real, ranting about this for literally years, and my North American friends are very sick of hearing me talk about this, so thank you for inviting me to Europe. It's good to be here. Thank you in advance, so let's have some fun. So before we get into naming software, I should start by actually introducing myself. My name is Ruthie. I've spent over a decade writing software, rewriting software, sometimes writing about rewriting software. And before I go any further, I want to do a quick show of hands. Who here writes code as the main thing that you write all day? Cool, so maybe like 15%. And who here writes words about code as the main part of your job? That's like 80%. The remaining 5% of you, are you here to look at the awesome car in the lobby? Get in line, I want it first. So I'll be speaking today from the perspective of someone who both writes code and writes about code, so hopefully there'll be some insights or at least some food for thought here for everyone. So let's get into it. If you work with or around software, it's possible that you've seen this saying before, which is that there are only two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. And as a side note, if anyone else has feelings about cache invalidation, welcome to my life, and I will meet you at the bar later. There's something really cool about this saying, though, and that is that there exists an amended version. And here it is. The little bits of chuckling tell me where the software engineers are sitting, because it happens to be a funny joke. But that an amended version exists at all really nicely illustrates this essential fact about modern software development, which is that much of what we make is an amendment to, or an extension of, or otherwise built with or built atop something created by someone else. And that's true, right? Like, unless your company lawyers have told you that you have to write a clean room implementation of something to avoid being sued, or unless you're doing doctoral level research at the very boundaries of your field, mainstream software development these days, it's largely an exercise in making things with other people's code. And if we're always making things with other people's code, well, that implies that we're going to be spending a lot of our working lives learning about and getting to know projects and products and tools and APIs and methods and whatnot that are brand new to us. And when a project or product or tool or method or function is brand new to me and I'm getting to know it, my very first task is to build up my mental model of it. I want to understand how it connects with what I already know. And let's be real, what I'm actually doing is determining if this new thing is going to be good enough at solving my problem to justify the space it's going to take up in my projects and my code base and my brain. And so what's the very first piece of information that we get about some new abstract construct that we're trying to wrap our heads around? Its name. Its name has this functional value. It's the sticky note on the side of the shoebox that, you know, amongst the eternity of shoeboxes that comprises the way that my brain organizes things. But sometimes, names don't give us enough of a clue, or any clue, which shoebox to put the thing into. And sometimes we make things that other people are trying to cram into their virtual toolkits, into their mental shoeboxes. And you know what they're thinking? What even is this? What do I do with this? Am I dumb? Am I just not getting this? And I have no idea where this goes. So as people who use software, and people who write software, and people who write about software, we ought to take care to name things well. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Names within software, why they matter, why sometimes they are not great, and what we can do to make them better. First, why on earth is it so hard to name software? So let's start with a cynical reason, which is that all the good names are already taken. And we've kept things pretty abstract up until right now, so let's get specific just for a little bit. Let's just go through a little thought exercise around creating and documenting this piece of software together. So I happen to keep a daily to-do list. It's this situation right here. It's checked boxes, which is nice to have literal check boxes, because then I can like draw the actual boxes to check off, which make me feel happy and productive, even when the words next to the box say like leave the house. We've all been there. And let's say I'm getting sick of carrying that notebook around. Well, I'm also carrying this around. Technology. How hard can it be to reproduce this functionality and recreate that experience of that notebook in code? Famous last words. Okay, so I'm going to create this app, right? It's going to be great. First thing I'm going to do is set up my Git repository. So GitHub, by the way, recognizes that naming is hard, and it kind of tries to help me out in this really adorable way. I don't know if you can see that, but it suggests a name for me. And the name that it suggested for me was Improved Disco, which is like a really cool name, but maybe not so good for like a to-do app. So maybe I'll just come up with a name. I'm gonna, let's say, to-do list. That seems like a pretty reasonable name for a to-do app. It's boring, but you know, it works. Let me just check to make sure there isn't already something out there with that. Nay, crap. Not only is there something already out there with exactly the name that I chose, there's also something out there for every other name that I was able to come up with in the space of, let's call it an hour. So that's kind of a problem. And if I were a marketer or like a brand strategist, right now we could meander off into a discussion about naming products, and there's definitely some interesting stuff to talk about there. But we've only got half an hour. And so instead of that, instead of talking about bad names for software, let's instead talk about maybe not great names within software. I'd like to focus on those. And it turns out that naming within software has the same problem as naming of software. There's this notion in functional software development of overloading, where the same function can behave differently when given a different context. And names can be overloaded too. The same name can have a different meaning when used in a different context, even within the same project. And good luck keeping track. So I'm going to share some examples. First one is a friend of mine works at a company that makes it easier for people to plan and hold events. And what they found is that if they called their events, people would like not use it because it felt too heavy. Like an event feels like something really serious, as opposed to just like, you know, come over for dinner. So it felt like too much of a commitment, and they wanted to keep it light. So they decided to call events invites. So you get invited to an invite. Now in the code, there's a function that sends out emails letting people who have been invited know that they've been invited. Those emails are also called invites. So there's a method that sends invites to people who have been invited to an invite. Not confusing at all. I imagine it would be somewhat difficult to write documentation for that feature. So here's another example. I recently worked on a code base that uses a framework called React and a library called Redux, and you don't have to know anything about those other than in Redux, there's this core concept of a container. It's a way to organize your application data. So the only thing you have to know is that in Redux, containers are a thing. So this company that I was working for makes software for trash haulers, so people who empty dumpsters for a living. And the thing that I learned is that the waste hauling industry really hates the word dumpster. It's like going up to someone in tech and asking them about the Googles. Like they're not going to take you seriously if you say dumpster. Anyone want to take a guess as to what word they use? Containers. So in the code base, everything in green refers to trash receptacles. The blue refers to this like core Redux container thing, and this totally didn't confuse me for like my first 2 months on that project. The best part about this one, by the way, is that the way that this entire code base was run on my laptop was inside of a Docker container. All right, so let's move on to another reason why naming software is hard. Descriptive naming is hard because it's reductive, and we're bad at choosing what to leave out. it's not possible to convey the totality of meaning and implication of an abstract construct in a single word. And yet that's what we're doing, or trying to do, every time we name a variable or a class or a method. And I'm going to repeat myself because I don't think that the Java runtime environment heard me. It is not possible to convey the totality of meaning and implication of an abstract construct in a single word, and so it should please stop trying. And we'll get into what makes a good name later, but a good rule of thumb is doesn't line wrap twice. All right, so another reason why naming software is hard. The name you give something will evoke unknown things for your reader. You don't even know who your reader is, so you have no idea what it's going to call to mind for them. And as an industry, we're kind of horrifyingly bad at anticipating the kinds of things that the names we choose will evoke. We sort of get this weird collective tunnel vision, and we fail to appreciate that others who are using our product, particularly in a global economy, may have different contexts. So the following examples, I've cherry-picked just a very few, but you should know that I cut about 20, just in the interest of time. And maybe I'll share the full list at some point. So they range from sort of questionable to appalling. So this is, CockroachDB is actually an excellent product. It's actually not a terrible name. It's a pretty good name in one sense, which is that the name sort of evokes the survivability of your data, which is their core value proposition. Like, it kind of makes sense. But I ask you, would you be likely to consider using this product if you'd recently had to deal with a roach infestation? How comfortable of an experience would that be for you? How much would you hate your job? So this is the name of software, but let's go back to names within software. There's this model of communication in like software processes where one process has like one-way control over other processes. This is like pretty common in database architecture, where you have one database that is sort of in charge of other databases that are just copies of it, that are like synced to it. And this model, does anyone know what this is called? I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, it's a little problematic. The master-slave architecture is a very common thing that you will learn about when you're learning about how to architect your database. Yeah, it's not exactly neutral terminology. And if you haven't had enough accidental racism for one day, in email marketing, this comes up a lot, blacklists and whitelists. Again, it's one of those things where, think about what these words connote, and then tell me that these terms are totally neutral. For this one, I like to share sort of a positive reimagining of it, which I've seen, which is a number of organizations have actually started replacing their use of each of these terms with block list and allow list, which is the same number of letters, actually communicates what it is that you're trying to communicate, and doesn't, accidentally lead people to believe terrible things about you and your organization. So that's cool. And then there's this. Which I think speaks for itself. So I'm gonna just broadly stereotype for just a moment, which is to say that people who write software and who write about software, like, we care about precision, and we're big into technically correct. And this is technically correct. And the problem with things that are technically correct is that sometimes they are not the most emotionally intelligent choice. This one is crazy. All right, let's move on to yet another reason why naming software is hard. The first time we make something, or the first time we're writing about making something, we all know what a first draft is like. We're making our best guess at what the appropriate name is for that thing. And sometimes we guess wrong. When you're naming a thing, you're trying to distill it to its essence, and you don't know what its essence is yet because you're still in the act of making it. I just like to share this because it kind of nicely illustrates the concept, also happens to be my favorite book, which is in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. A whale materializes several miles above the surface of an alien planet and begins immediately falling to its very rapid death. But since because of this, it has to sort of very rapidly come to terms with its existence. And I love that it does so by naming things. And at the beginning of a project, I kind of feel a little bit like this whale, hopefully without the impending doom aspect. So anyway, naming is guesswork. And that little to-do app thought exercise we were doing before, when I was playing around with it, I thought that I would just need notions of like task and maybe paper. But then I discovered that I needed a notion of recurring task, because it turns out you should leave your house every day. And that notion of complete is different from just completing a task, like finishing writing a talk. Different concepts. And it turns out that I don't need the notion of paper at all. But the way that I wrote this thing from the beginning, it has this paper thing in it, and there's all this sort of cognitive cruft in my code, and all of my docs are wrong. So this is something that is the first time we're working on a project, or as we're getting our project to that sort of 1.0 or 0.1 line. Maybe this is familiar, that kind of little bit of code soup that you end up in. And by the way, the fact that naming is guesswork, that's why you can never avoid incurring technical debt, and why you can never avoid the need for refactoring and rewriting. We discover what our software is meant to do as we write it. And it's not until we've written it that we're able to judge whether or not we've written it well or correctly. And I like sharing the Unix philosophy here, which is there's a reason why making it right is the second and not the first part of this philosophy. This guides how Unix is developed, which I think is pretty cool. And at this point, a totally reasonable person might say, look, all of this naming stuff seems to be taking a whole lot of brain effort, and we don't have a single line of code written yet of that to-do app, and like, let's just make the thing. Maybe it doesn't matter what names we use within our software. Because after all, it's not like end users will ever see that, right? This is not a stock photo. This is a photo that I personally took at the San Francisco airport. I took this photo on my way to the Write the Docs Portland, while waiting for that flight. I was like, this is kind of perfect. And at least, by the way, at least they used a reasonable variable name, like message text. That at least you sort of understand what happened here. But what if they thought to them, the developer who worked on this, what if they thought to themselves, no one's ever going to see this, I'm going to call it foo. Or I'm going to call it random cat keyboard stuff. Or I'm going to call it my boss is a jerk. Those could have all been bad. So choosing reasonable variable names matters even when you don't think that it will. And those are just some reasons, though not an exhaustive list, of why it's hard to name software. And so it's perhaps not surprising that, we get it wrong some of the time. But here's the thing about software is that, we're not carving stone tablets. We all have delete keys. Why is it that bad names seem to persist? Well, maybe we don't realize the name is bad. This can look like a couple of different things. It can look like an empathy failure. The problems caused by this bad name don't affect me, therefore those problems don't exist. And I think perhaps some of us know this person. It could look like a beginner's mind failure. This is perfectly clear to me, the person who wrote this software. I don't remember what it was like to not understand this because I have never had the experience of not understanding this, because I made it. So this is a thing that can happen with legacy software a lot. Or it can look like a localization failure. This is a real thing, and I suggest Googling it. There's another reason, that's possibly, those are some possible reasons why bad names persist, because we don't know that they're bad names. Another possibility is that maybe we do recognize that the name is bad, but we can't or aren't able to justify fixing it. And this is probably familiar territory for documentarians, because very often your job is to explain something that, had it been named better, wouldn't have required much of an explanation at all. At risk of preaching to the choir, what can this look like? It can look like a failure of over-attachment, maybe for sentimental reasons, to a name that is no longer fit for purpose. And this failure mode is experienced by company founders a lot, or people who have spent a lot of time developing a thing. It can look like simple knee-jerk hatred of change, because that is a pretty universal human experience. It can take the form of overestimating the cost of changing a name. And we can sort of assign different reasons to this. Either we're nervous or we're a junior developer and we don't have a good sense of how long it'll take us to do something, or we're just feeling particularly lazy that day and don't feel like refactoring the thing. But it can also take the form of underestimating the value that the improved name will generate. AKA, it works, don't touch it. And so, I mean, the problem is that this is projection, which means on some level it's guesswork, and it can be hard to sort of quantify that and justify that to people who are like, how many developer hours are we burning on this? So those are some reasons why we live with bad names. We either don't recognize that the names are bad, or we do recognize they're bad, but we lack the will or the ability or the agency to change them. And so we've talked a lot about bad names so far, and maybe now would be a good moment to mention what makes a name good or bad. And this is something we think about both when we're writing software and when we're documenting software. And despite thinking a lot about this, I still struggle with coming up with a sort of concise and comprehensive answer to this, because naming is a balancing act. A name shouldn't be too long, but it also shouldn't be too short. It should adhere to your style guide, except for when doing so would cause more confusion, which you then have to decide how much confusion that is. It should avoid ambiguity, unless ambiguity is the point. It should be easy to pronounce, unless that doesn't matter, and by the way, easy to pronounce is very relative. And it should be memorable, but not for the wrong reasons. Naming's inherently a judgment call, and we can't automate or abstract that away. And so the best I can do is share some heuristics for assessing whether a name is good or bad in the context of being understood by the humans working on it. Because good or bad is only meaningful in that context. Bad names confuse, they frustrate, they misguide, they obscure, they offend. Good names make aha moments happen, often by connecting or analogizing a virtual interface or concept with a physical one or a tangible one in a way that correctly sets expectations about what the thing does, what it's responsible for, and how it might respond to a user's interaction with it. Good names contextualize, they illuminate, they empower, they explain, they don't break my brain's mental shoebox filing system. Usually. And it would definitely be useful to have a rigorous mental framework for assessing a name's quality, and I personally would really like to have one, because that would mean that I could think less about variable names and more about like everything else in the world. But ultimately, I think it's kind of a fool's errand. Like, no two people's frameworks are ever going to match. And heck, the framework that I have, my heuristics, aren't going to match the heuristics that I had a month ago, or that I'm going to have a month from now. So that leads to sort of the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is, how can we name software better? And I can tell you that it would be great if technology could solve this problem for us. But there is a reason why there is no app called Fix My Broken Names. I looked. It doesn't exist. Technology can help us with the mechanics of naming things well. For example, we can do a search to find similarly named functions. We can do that across a code base. We have automated linters and automated style guide enforcers that can, prevent the Java situation from happening, or from being capitalized inconsistently. And the tools that we use to document software are actually pretty good at exposing like inconsistencies in API method names, for example. And all that's valuable. But it doesn't help us much with the hard part of naming, which is the part that requires our judgment. That's on us. And earlier we talked about names as having functional value, but it turns out that naming is not a purely functional act. We name the things we care about. Naming, in its own small way, even in the context of, software, can be an act of love. And that care, that closeness, that love that we feel for the things that we make and the things that we work with and the things that we write about can sometimes cloud judgment. But the good news is that we who write software and we who write about software and we who use software, we have this superpower. I don't know if you guys know this. We have a superpower, which is that our judgment about names is pretty finely honed because it is literally our job to think about this all day, every day. And we're pretty excellent at recognizing when names in software leave room for improvement. So my ask is that we use our documentarian judgment well. When we encounter a name that doesn't quite sit right with us, we take a deep breath and remember that poorly named API method or nonsensical function signature, it's not there to spite us. And just remember that software is made not by jerks on the internet, but by humans, like you and me, who are doing the hard work of giving form and name to shiny new things that enable us to build the stuff of our dreams. Just some food for thought. I'm on the social network of your choice as @unruthless, and you should definitely come talk to me about any other terrible names in software that you've encountered, because I'd really like to make that list grow. I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all so much.